Part 1. The world's biggest debt paradox. Almost every country in the world is in debt. The United States now owes more than $38 trillion, the highest debt in its history. The European Union carries around $14 trillion in debt, while Japan owes close to $9 trillion. And that's not all. Even wealthy oil-producing nations like Saudi Arabia, along with export giants such as Germany and China, are carrying enormous amounts of debt. So here's the question. If everyone is in debt, who is the creditor? At first glance, it seems like a simple question, but in reality, it sits at the very heart of the modern financial system. Why? Because when money, power, and history collide, nothing is ever as simple as it appears. Most people think of debt as nothing more than money that has to be paid back. But the truth is much more complicated. Debt isn't just a liability. It's one of the foundations of the modern global economy. From wars to financial crises, from stock market booms to devastating market crashes. Many of the biggest events in history have been built on this invisible system of debt. And once you start looking a little closer, you discover something truly surprising. The world isn't actually in debt to one specific country or one particular institution. In a way, the world owes money to itself. But that doesn't mean everyone benefits equally from the system. Today, global debt has climbed to more than $315 trillion. To put that into perspective, that's nearly 3 times the total value of everything the entire world produces in a single year. So how did we get here? To answer that question, we have to travel back hundreds of years. Back before credit cards, before online banking, before modern banking even existed. If the year was 1694, England was at war with France. As the war dragged on, the country's gold reserves began running out. The government desperately needed money. So the king tried something completely different. He turned to wealthy merchants and asked them for loans. In return, he offered them something they couldn't refuse. "I'll pay you regular interest using future tax revenue." The merchants agreed. And with that single decision, financial history changed forever. To manage this new system, the Bank of England was created. Today, this idea sounds perfectly normal. But back then, it was revolutionary. For the first time, a government could spend money it didn't actually have. And in return, the lenders received an official promise from the government that they would be paid back. As time went on, those promises could be bought, sold, and traded from one person to another. That was the birth of what we now know as government bonds, and it marked the beginning of the modern financial system. France adopted the model. The Netherlands improved it. Then the newly independent United States used the same system to finance both its War of Independence and its westward expansion. From that moment on, government debt was no longer seen as a sign of weakness. It became a symbol of credibility. Because the most powerful country wasn't the one with the most gold stored in its vaults, it was the one that could convince people to lend it money. Part 2. Who is the real creditor? As the years passed, the idea of government borrowing spread across the world. Centuries ago, empires grew rich by conquering new lands and bringing home gold, silver, and other valuable resources. Today, the rules have completely changed. Instead of conquering territories, governments issue bonds to raise money and generate long-term financing. The financial markets have become the new battlefield. Balance sheets have replaced swords. 3 centuries later, debt has evolved into the foundation of the global financial system. Today, the United States owes more than $38 trillion. Japan's debt has surpassed $9 trillion. And global debt continues to grow by roughly $1 trillion every 100 days. In other words, even while you're watching this video, the system is creating more debt. Now let's stop for a moment and ask the same question again. If there's this much debt, who is the creditor? Most people answer without even thinking. China owns America. It sounds reasonable, but reality is far more complicated. Of America's $38 trillion debt, nearly half is owed not to government agencies, but to investors. So who are these investors? Surprisingly, most of them are Americans. Commercial banks, pension funds, mutual funds, insurance companies, and even the Federal Reserve itself. Only about 1/3 of America's debt is held by foreign investors. Yes, Japan is the largest foreign holder of U.S. Treasury bonds, with roughly $1 trillion. China follows with around $800 billion. Then come the United Kingdom, Luxembourg, and Belgium. So when people say, America owes China, they're not completely wrong. But they're missing most of the picture, because China's holdings represent only a small fraction of America's total debt. The truth is, America's biggest creditor is, in many ways, America itself. Here's how the system works. The U.S. Treasury issues government bonds. Banks and investment funds buy those bonds. Whenever necessary, the Federal Reserve purchases many of them from the market. And in the process, it creates new dollars. Americans pay taxes. Those tax revenues are used to pay interest on government bonds. And that interest eventually flows right back into American pension funds and investment portfolios. Money keeps circulating within the same financial ecosystem. At first glance, the system looks incredibly complicated. But underneath it all lies a massive self-sustaining financial web. The debt is real. But in many cases, the creditor is simply another part of the same system. And what's even more interesting, this isn't unique to the United States. It's how much of the global financial system works. Japan buys U.S. Treasury bonds. The United States lends money to other countries through the IMF. Europe provides financing to developing nations through the World Bank. Those developing countries then invest their foreign exchange reserves in the government bonds of advanced economies. Money constantly moves from one country to another. One nation lends to another. That nation lends to someone else. Eventually, the money circles back again. It's an endless chain. Imagine it like a poker table. Every player borrowed their chips from the person sitting next to them. No one is really playing with their own money. And there's only one rule that keeps the game alive. Nobody gets up from the table. Because the moment someone does, the entire system begins to shake. But there's an even more powerful player in this story, an invisible force that ultimately sets the rules for everyone else. The markets. Part 3. Who really runs the system? So far, we've seen how countries lend money to one another, but the truth is, there's an even more powerful player behind the entire system, perhaps even more powerful than governments themselves. The financial markets. Behind every government bond lies an enormous network of investors. Pension funds, hedge funds, sovereign wealth funds, investment firms, and central banks managing trillions of dollars in assets. These institutions have the power to shape the fate of entire nations. Will a country be able to borrow at low interest rates? Or will investors lose confidence and demand much higher returns? More often than not, those decisions aren't made by politicians. They're made by the markets. Think about it. A country's economy is only as strong as the confidence people have in it. As long as investors believe this country will repay its debt, everything continues to function. But the moment that confidence disappears, everything changes. The currency begins to lose value. Interest rates climb. Investors start pulling their money out. And sometimes, even the world's strongest governments can find themselves facing a full-blown financial crisis within just a few weeks. That's why you've probably heard this phrase before. Democracy decides who governs. The markets decide who survives. It may sound harsh at first, but it's one of the most important truths behind the modern financial system. So who sits at the very center of all this? Central banks. Most people think central banks simply set interest rates. In reality, they do far more than that. They don't just manage debt. In many ways, they help create it. Take the U.S. Federal Reserve as an example. Whenever it buys government bonds, it creates new money in exchange. The European Central Bank operates in much the same way. In other words, one institution's liability becomes another institution's valuable asset. That's why economists often say, every dollar is someone else's debt. It sounds strange, but that's exactly how the modern monetary system works. Every bill in your wallet, every dollar in your bank account, every euro, yen, or dollar circulating through the global economy exists because debt was created somewhere in the system. Simply put, there is no such thing as debt-free money. The moment new money enters the economy, an equal financial obligation is created somewhere else. And for decades, this entire mechanism has been held together by one thing: trust. As long as people believe governments will continue meeting their financial obligations, the system keeps moving forward. What's interesting is that most investors aren't actually expecting governments to eliminate their debt completely. They simply want to believe that interest payments will continue to be made, because the moment that trust disappears, the entire system begins to crack. And history has already shown us exactly what that looks like. Several times. Part 4. Why do governments never really pay off their debt? So what happens when investors lose confidence? This isn't just a theory. History has shown us the answer more than once. Take Greece in 2010. After years of borrowing, the country's debt had become impossible to repay. The moment that news spread across the markets, investors panicked. They rushed to sell their government bonds. Bond yields skyrocketed. And suddenly, Greece found it almost impossible to borrow any more money. That's when the European Central Bank and the International Monetary Fund stepped in. From the outside, it looked as if Greece had been rescued. But that rescue came at a heavy price. Taxes were increased. Government spending was slashed. Salaries were cut. Unemployment soared. For years, millions of people continued to live with the consequences of that crisis. That's why, for many Greeks, the phrase bailout package doesn't mean rescue. It means sacrifice. We've seen a similar story unfold in Argentina. The country defaulted on its debt multiple times. After every crisis came new loans. Then another crisis followed. Eventually, debt stopped being just an economic issue. It became a chronic national problem. Sri Lanka experienced something even more dramatic. When the government ran out of the foreign currency needed to repay its external debt, the consequences were immediate. Fuel stations were overwhelmed with miles-long lines. Power outages became common. Supermarket shelves emptied, and eventually, the government itself collapsed. All of these events reveal something important. When the system is working, we rarely notice the creditors. But the moment it starts falling apart, the IMF credit rating agencies and the anonymous investors holding billions of dollars in government bonds suddenly become impossible to ignore. But here's the most fascinating part. Even after crises like these, the system doesn't fundamentally change. If anything, it simply starts over. Old debts are restructured. New government bonds are issued. Old loans are paid off with new ones. And the machine keeps running. Because the real purpose of the modern financial system isn't to eliminate debt. It's to keep it moving. This may be the most surprising idea in this entire video. Most people assume governments are working toward one day paying off all their debt. The truth is, that's never really been the plan. Yes, you heard that right. For most countries, the goal isn't to reduce debt to zero. It's to keep it at a level that's sustainable and manageable. It may sound strange, but economists have a name for this process: refinancing. In simple terms, it means taking on new debt to replace old debt. Think of it like this. Imagine your credit card bill is due. Instead of paying it off with your own savings, you take out a low-interest loan from another bank. The debt doesn't disappear. It simply changes form. Governments operate in much the same way. Old bonds mature. New ones are issued, and the cycle continues. That's why investors aren't actually waiting to get their principal back. What matters most to them is that interest payments keep coming, and that the system keeps functioning. Because today's global economy isn't built on paying debt off completely. It's built on rolling debt forward. And that brings us to perhaps the most fascinating question of all. What if every government actually paid off all of its debt? At first, it sounds like the perfect solution, but in reality, it could become one of the biggest financial disasters the world has ever seen. Part 5. What if governments paid off all their debt? Now let's look at a question that seems perfectly logical. If a country has so much debt, why doesn't it just pay it all off? After all, we've all been taught the same lesson since childhood. Debt is bad. If you owe money, pay it back. For individuals, that's usually good advice, but for governments, the rules are completely different. In fact, the world's largest economies aren't trying to eliminate their debt. Quite the opposite. They're constantly replacing it with new debt, because the modern financial system isn't built on debt coming to an end. It's built on debt continuing to exist. Let's imagine something. Suppose tomorrow morning, the United States makes a historic announcement. Today, we're paying off every single dollar of our $38 trillion national debt. Your first reaction would probably be, "That's amazing news." But to the financial markets, it would be nothing short of an earthquake. Because U.S. Treasury bonds aren't just pieces of government debt. They're also considered one of the safest financial assets in the world. Banks keep them on their balance sheets. Pension funds rely on them to secure millions of people's retirements. Insurance companies store a significant portion of their reserves in them. And central banks treat them as assets that are almost as trustworthy as money itself. Now imagine what happens if America pays off every dollar it owes. First, a huge portion of U.S. Treasury bonds would disappear from the market. And with them, one of the world's safest financial assets would disappear as well. This wouldn't be a problem for America alone. The entire global economy would feel the impact. Banks would lose some of their safest collateral. Investment funds would have to rebuild their portfolios. Central banks would be forced to rethink their reserve strategies. Financial markets would suddenly face enormous uncertainty. But that's not the only consequence. As government bonds are paid off, the amount of dollars circulating throughout the financial system would shrink dramatically. In other words, the money supply would begin to contract. That could trigger what economists call deflation. Consumers would postpone spending. Businesses would delay investments. Production would slow down. Unemployment would rise. And economic growth would begin to reverse. Ironically, the idea of paying off all the debt, which sounds like the perfect solution, could actually make the economy much worse. That's why governments don't aim to eliminate their debt. Instead, they continue issuing new bonds. The goal isn't to borrow recklessly. The goal is to keep the system functioning. In many ways, debt is the heartbeat of modern capitalism. Just as the human heart must keep pumping blood to sustain life, the economy needs a continuous flow of capital to keep moving. That's why new government bonds are issued every day. Old bonds mature, new ones replace them, and the system keeps breathing. This is also why politicians often promise to pay off the national debt. It sounds appealing, but in practice, it's almost impossible. The real objective isn't to eliminate debt. It's to keep it at a level that investors continue to trust. Because the true foundation of this system isn't money, it's confidence. As long as people believe governments will continue honoring their obligations, the machine keeps running. But the moment that confidence disappears, the size of the debt itself becomes almost irrelevant. Interest rates surge, investors pull their money out, and a financial system built on decades of trust begins to crack. Perhaps that's the biggest secret of sovereign debt. The plan was never to pay it all back. The plan was to keep the world believing that one day it could be. Part 6. Who is the debt really owed to? So far, we've learned one thing. Countries lend money to one another. Banks finance governments. Central banks inject money into the financial system. Investment funds buy government bonds. From the outside, it looks like everyone is both a debtor and a creditor. So let's return to the question we asked at the very beginning. If everyone is in debt, who is the creditor? The answer isn't as simple as it seems. In one sense, the world really does owe money to itself. But that's only half the story, because money doesn't flow back to everyone equally. Interest payments aren't distributed evenly across society. Millions of people pay taxes, but much of the interest funded by those taxes ultimately flows to the institutions and investors that own government bonds. So debt isn't just money moving between countries. It's also a massive transfer of wealth within society itself. In other words, the biggest winners in this system are often those who own the debt, not those who simply pay for it. That's one of the reasons why global debt and global wealth inequality have continued to grow together. And this isn't unique to any one country. It's true in the United States. It's true across Europe. It's true throughout Asia. In fact, you'll find the same pattern almost everywhere the modern financial system exists. But there's one important point we shouldn't overlook. In this story, creditors aren't simply the villains, and debtors aren't simply the victims, because the system isn't controlled by one person or one institution. All of us are part of it, Governments borrow money, banks issue loans, investors buy government bonds, pension funds hold those bonds for retirement savings. We pay taxes. And one day, many of us receive pensions that are funded by those very same investments. Whether we realize it or not, we're all part of the same machine. So the real question is this: can this machine keep running forever? Every system needs fuel to survive. The fuel of the modern financial system isn't oil, it's trust. As long as people continue trusting governments, as long as investors continue buying government bonds, as long as banks continue lending, the system keeps moving forward. But if that trust is ever seriously shaken, the entire structure we've built over generations could begin to crack much faster than anyone expects. And perhaps, on that day, we'll remember what debt really is. Because debt isn't just an accounting entry on a balance sheet. It's a promise made to the future. And no promise can be postponed forever. Closing. The next time you hear the news say, "The national debt has reached another record high," you probably won't ask, "Why is there so much debt?" Instead, you'll ask a different question. Who is the debt really owed to? Maybe there isn't a single answer. Because in the modern financial system, we're both the creditors and the debtors. And perhaps the most fascinating part of all is this: the entire system works only as long as people continue believing in it. As long as trust survives, the wheel keeps turning. But the moment the trust disappears, the numbers themselves stop mattering. And that may be the greatest paradox of the modern economy.